All right, the video we're going to watch today is Why America is Terribly Designed by OBF.
The pink patches represent parking lots, and as you can see, they're all quite large and quite close to each other. Now, Philadelphia has a population of 1.6 million people, but they have 2.
I'm interrupting the video already right now. Why American parking lots all like this? Why don't you build them high and then like stack cars on top of each other? Why do they have to be open plan, every single one of them? I don't quite understand. In the UK, particularly the inner cities and inner towns, you find that a lot of parking garages are like stacked multi-tier ones.
Philadelphia has a population of 1.6 million people, but they have 2.2 million parking spaces. So Philadelphia has more car slots than it does human beings.
Yeah, this was like a multi-story car park. This is kind of what I mean.
So let's compare Philadelphia to a European city. Amsterdam, for example. A city that's roughly the same size in population, but with a
oh my god, Amsterdam is so beautiful. Oh my goodness.
View on urban planning. Now sure, they do have parking lots, but instead of having an excess of 1 per person, they instead have 1 for every 3 people. Although that's not the entire story, because 40% of these parking spaces are actually underground, making room above ground for what is significantly more important: sidewalks and bike lanes. And to understand why they are so important, you only need to use some common sense. See, if you have a car-based city, or country for that matter, with no bike lanes or sidewalks, you are actively excluding those who can't afford to pay thousands of dollars a year on a car from society, since they can't go to and from work or even to the grocery store in a safe, efficient way. And if you add to that, terrible public transportation.
All right, please don't misinterpret what I'm saying as America hating, but it blows my mind sometimes in America when they say public transport sucks. I have so much more respect for public transport now than I ever have, because I remember as a kid having to go from town and back on a bus and hating it and be like, oh, cars are so easy, you dodge all the traffic, you go like twice as fast. But now I think back, I'm like, wow. Now I own a car, I know all the costs associated with a car. Man, I have so much respect for buses and trains, so much respect. And it's funny, now I think about it, hand on heart, is I think maybe the UK could go further with its public transport as well, but having to deal with car culture is so hard. You have to wrestle them constantly.
Since America is designed for cars, not humans. And while there are some sidewalks and bike lanes in the United States' largest cities, they are either unprotected and really scary to use, or just end abruptly, with no other option but to use the street itself to walk or bike on. See, the streets of Amsterdam, for example, are filled with pedestrians because they have sidewalks that aren't at all scary to use.
I feel this is difficult territory to talk about, because whenever I talk about the pros of cycling, I feel like a lot of car drivers get really freaking angry. Everyone must have experienced this at some point. There's like a Facebook post, and it'll be something like biker runs red light, and then the comments will be flooded really, really angry car drivers. They just don't understand that every time there's a cyclist on the road or on the path, that's 1 less car. Just think about that for a second. 1 less car. Think about the amount of space that a cyclist takes up. So your anti-bike stance is actively encouraging traffic jams. You're actively saying, no, I want to be more traffic jams. I enjoy traffic jams. Traffic jams are my favorite things. But think about it. Every time there's an extra cyclist, there's less cars on the road. And I cycle, and I also simultaneously drive. But I only cycle for leisure. It's not commuting. I actively feel like I can vouch for both sides. Centrists for commuting as well. Centrists for everything.
The most beautiful thing about Amsterdam, though, is that it's incredibly bike-friendly, as it's filled with designated bike lanes that don't end abruptly and are
I was in Berlin a few years back, 3 years ago, and the cycle lanes were amazing. Oh, they were so good. I'll admit, they can go a step further. Cycle highways are the way forward. The ones that are like dedicated away from the road and they've got barriers to prevent cars from cutting into the bike lane. They're the best, obviously, options. But man, I cycled around Berlin. It was amazing. They had these little bikes that you could rent, and you just use your phone to unlock them, and you paid per hour or whatever. You could visit all the places. Me and Marconi were on these little Uber e-bikes. They were so much fun to cycle. Berlin's like almost completely flat. We watched and we looked at all the highlights and all the tourist destinations. Oh, it was so fun. It was so good. And I feel like climbing in and out of taxis over and over again, or hiring a car, wouldn't have the same experience, because you're always like looking for somewhere to park. I'll admit, if you never drove before, one of the most stressful things you have to deal with as a driver is finding somewhere to park. Having to find that location, and then you think to yourself, oh, well, I don't have to pay for parking, so I'm going to park a little bit further away, I'm going to have to walk. And at the end of the day, with all that actually rigmarole that you have to deal with, it would have been better just to fucking walk anyway, or take a bike, or take a bus. cause. If there's no infrastructure for bikes, they cause traffic. Are you making a problem that doesn't exist there? Are you trying to tell me that a cyclist on the road is actively taking up the entirety of the road so you can't overtake them? I can understand with a country road, when the roads are really narrow and they're very bendy. In that instance, yeah, I can understand like maybe a cyclist would cause you to brake a little bit before you can overtake because you need to check if it's clear ahead before you overtake. Sure, I understand that predicament. But in a built-up road, with a road with multiple lanes, a wide road with a speed limit of 40 or 50 miles an hour, you're never going to have that problem with a cyclist because they're always going to be tucked in.
Amsterdam even has no car zones and even underground bike parking spaces that look pretty insane.
What the
Something
hell?
you'd never find in the US.
Oh my god, it's
but
like...
if you think it's unfair to compare the United States to literally the best city for bikes in the world, then just remember it's practically the same story in all of Europe's largest cities like Copenhagen or Paris. Now sure, they aren't at the same level as Amsterdam.
If you're going to say to me, okay, the reason why I hate cyclists is they cause traffic, let's just go down that route. In that case, you should be pro bike lanes, pro bike highways. You should be pro all these things. You need to find a middle ground here, guys. There isn't an extreme option. You pick the extreme no bikes on the road, please wear a helmet, please have insurance, please be taxed, and nobody will want to cycle anymore. And you'd have roads full of cars because everyone's on a car. I guess that the issue is a road is a road, okay? You can't really argue of what a road is. When it comes down to a bicycle lane, they vary in different designs. Some of them are on the path and they're a dedicated lane on the path. Some are dedicated on the road. For instance, the ones on the road are annoying because there's a car that might be parked and you have to go around the car, so you're actively having to go into the road because a car has parked on this into the cycling lane. Ah, man, the only option here, guys, to actually find a proper solution to this is that cyclists and cars need to work together. That there isn't a ground here where you just say, oh, well, they're annoying, so let's get rid of them, or let's not appease to them. At the end of the day, the end result is more infrastructure and kind of like encouraging more people to get on their bikes by loosening regulations. They actually found that when you make it mandatory to wear helmets to cycle, less people cycle. That's the knock-on effect. Unfortunately, laws have a knock-on effect.
Whenever I bike around Copenhagen, I don't feel like a car is going to hit me because we have our own designated lanes that are sometimes as wide as the road itself. And you might think, well, the United States will never be able to get to that level, so why even compare them? But the thing is, and this might surprise you, not too long ago, the United States' largest cities were actually designed exactly like these European cities. Take for example Houston, that currently looks like this, with tons of space allocated to these massive parking lots. In 1920, Houston looked like this, with a lot more space for pedestrians. This means the United States didn't design their cities to be this way, they bulldozed them to be. And while European metropolitan areas are increasingly rolling back on the car's dominance with high-speed trains, metros, and non-automotive methods of transit, the United States is increasing their dependence on cars by expanding highways and demolishing houses, apartment complexes, businesses, and schools to fit them. Which doesn't really make any sense. I mean, if a city is expanding their number of highway lanes from 16 to 20, there is a problem. Well, currently only 5% of Americans use public transportation, and there's actually a very simple reason for that. It's terrible. This is a map of Chicago's train system. If you look at its design, it's not very hard to figure out what it was built to do. All its different lines intersect here, in Chicago's downtown, and then fan outward. This is a system that's really good at moving people between the suburbs or the outer rings of the city and then downtown.
This is not the best example because this is a simplified chart. It doesn't represent distance though, does it? So this isn't probably the best example to say why it's bad.
But studies show that today, the most common American commute is actually from suburb to suburb, routes that public transit in the US usually doesn't serve. And the train routes that do exist aren't exactly desirable. I think it's time to talk about Amtrak. Amtrak has become somewhat of a plague on the American railway system, with constant train derailment, increased taxpayer funding, expensive tickets, and lack of connectivity. This means most Americans aren't too keen on using trains to get around, even if they technically serve a route they could use. Stations are also far from each other, and major train-riding cities like Boston, Washington, and New Jersey haven't gotten an upgrade in years. The system pales in comparison to Switzerland's sophisticated railways that more than 450 million passengers use each year, which by the way is around 13 times as many passengers as Amtrak has per year.
You know, I've just had a thought. This is quite frequently an argument you hear quite often. They'll go, public transport in America is bad, but it's really good in Europe. And then they'll go, well, Europe, America's a lot bigger. Is that really a good argument? Because technically, if you break down every state in America and then every district and every city, surely there's enough funding if you were to see the same like-for-like capacitor funding of infrastructure as Europe to be able to do these projects. I mean, America is insanely rich. Surely there's an option to be able to fund these infrastructure projects. Size really isn't a matter when it comes down to the state's autonomy and the city's autonomy to be able to build these projects. I don't really understand this size argument.
It's absolutely insane. But even with Congress's recent plans to hand $30 billion over to Amtrak for a high-speed train, Amtrak has no plans to use that money for such a system.
Using a train in the UK is expensive. This is why I usually car to visit towns nowadays. I guess it all depends on how many trips you make, I guess, doesn't it? You hear that quite often, that trains in the UK are expensive. But I suppose, what do you compare that to? Have you been traveling on trains in Europe? I don't know. I know you hear that quite frequently. But when you take into account tax and insurance and petrol and obviously buying the vehicle itself, I feel like those costs really add up. For instance, me at the minute, I own a car, but I don't commute. I work from home. And I feel like at the moment, I don't really get a lot for my car, to be honest with you. I want to see if the theory is true, because I've heard this meme as well, that apparently trains in mainland Europe are cheaper than in the UK, and we apparently live in rip-off Britain. Train prices across Europe, the UK is at the top, as well as Norway. Wow. Yeah, it does look like it's true. It looks like it's true. The UK prices are higher than Europe. Let's not go a little bit too far, though. The difference is not massive. Here you go, guys. I've learned some new things here, guys. I feel like big brain. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I love you. Goodbye. This video technically is part 2.